What's up guys, TheRcCrawlerKing here, and today is Tech Tuesday where I show you guys some informational stuff about the radio control hobby. Today we're going to be doing a bleeding procedure on a remote reservoir RC shock, so without wasting any more time, let's jump into it. A few tools you're going to want to make sure you have are a fluid collection container, some paper towel, the shock you're servicing, some Allen wrenches, pliers, and some shock oil. Now we can begin servicing our shock. First thing to remove is the lower shock collar. Simply pull the spring back and remove the collar off of the shock rod. Next, slide the spring off and set it aside. Now that we have the spring and collar off, you can do a quick visual inspection on the shock to see if there's any obvious signs that need to be addressed before actually topping up the fluid level and bleeding the shock. Obviously check for leak points at the shock shaft seals and at the bleed screw and at the bottom of the reservoir and the top of the reservoir. So with this shock in particular, it must have too much air or not enough fluid in it because the shock shaft piston isn't actually coming back out to full extension. My best guess is that we likely have air inside the shock because we don't have any external fluid leaks. The first thing that I'm going to do is grab my special shock tool for these Gmade RSD shocks and slide it over the bottom cap of the reservoir. Loosening it with the left turn, I'll now be able to spin off the lower shock cap. Once the shock cap's fully loosened, have a quick look at it to make sure everything's in place and just set it off to the side. Now that we have access to the fluid reservoir, we're going to grab our container that we had and empty whatever fluid is left in here into our container. Okay, great. It would be best if you do have an adjustable secondary reservoir to back this screw off all the way so we get the maximum amount of fluid into the remote reservoir as possible. Now I'm going to be using a 17.5 weight shock oil in my trail truck shocks here. We'll fill up the reservoir with some shock fluid right to the very top. Here we go. You can see it, the shock fluid is just sitting at the top there. And now that we're done doing that, let's go ahead and grab our shock shaft assembly here. Make sure your piston's fully retracted so that we don't remove as much fluid as possible. You're going to want to make sure you put some paper towel down underneath this, it's going to be messy. Don't worry if some fluid leaks out, that's fine. Insert the assembly very slowly. Once it's in far enough, start to thread it in by hand. Make sure that shock shaft stays at full extension. I'm going to go ahead and grab my cap tool here, retighten on this lower reservoir cap. Now our shock's back together and the fluid is filled completely full. And you'll notice that we can't push the piston in. This was my original issue I ran into and I had a hard time finding a solution online. So here I am, I'm going to show you guys how to bleed this. Nice, simple. Grab a 1.5 millimeter Allen wrench. This is our bleed screw here on the top of the reservoir. All we're going to do is we're going to loosen this off, holding it in an upright position. Because air rises to the top, you want to make sure the bleed hole is at the top. Once the screw's backed off all the way, don't remove it from the hole. Just tilt it so that the air can escape. Slowly compress the piston. Very slowly. Do not pull the shaft back on at any point, otherwise you'll introduce air into the oil and we do not want that. Okay, now you can see our shock's completely compressed. Make sure that shaft doesn't get pulled out and retighten your bleed screw. Alright, There we go, our bleed screw's tight. But now you're gonna say, okay, but now the shock has a vacuum to it and the shaft pulls back in on its own. So the second part of this solution is actually to pull the shock shaft all the way, holding it out, loosen this screw again, just enough so that it cracks and is able to release the vacuum we created pushing the piston in all the way. Once you're able to tilt the screw, quickly tighten it back in. Now that the bleed screw is fully tightened, we should have a fully functioning remote reservoir shock. Pushing it in, it gets tight near the bottom and it fully extends on its own. And if we want to have that piston come out even further on its own, we simply tighten down the remote reservoir pressure screw. And now with that pressure screw tightened down all the way, the shock shaft is harder to press in and it also extends a bit further. Go ahead and wipe off all the excess fluid on the shock body itself. Now we can go ahead and grab our spring, slide that back on, pull that spring back, reinstall the lower collar onto the shaft, and there you have it, a fully reassembled remote reservoir shock that's functioning correctly and bled correctly. Alrighty guys, hopefully you learned some new technical information about the radio control hobby. If you guys did, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave me some comments down below about some other technical information you guys might want to know about the radio control hobby, and I'll add it to a future video. Thanks so much for watching guys, don't forget to be fancy, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.